It remains the #1 movie on IMDb.com, The Shawshank Redemption, but is it? This video is going to review and analyze the movie, and from my perspective, let's figure out whether it really is worthy of #1 ever, coming up next. The Shawshank Redemption, released in 1994, stars Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman. You know this because Morgan Freeman's voiceover narration, partly what makes, I think, his voiceovers famous.
All I want is to be back where things make sense, where I won't have to be afraid all the time.
Directed by Frank Darabont, this movie actually didn't win the Academy Award for Best Picture. To me, looking back, that's a surprise. But it is, as I said, #1 movie ever on IMDb.com over the last 20, maybe 25 years. It's held the top spot, an amazing 9.3 out of 10 ranking by hundreds of thousands of people. And although I don't put a lot of stock in metrics, in fact, very little, it is at least a sign that popular opinion-wise, and over a generation now, this movie still holds up for a great number of people. Now, a #1 movie ever should face a lot of scrutiny, and we're going to represent ourselves to future generations and to history by naming this the #1 movie ever. Does it deserve that ranking? That's partly what the video is going to be about. Now, I must say, as a person of this age, I was, 15 or 16 when this movie came out. In fact, I watched this movie on a 15-inch TV in my bedroom when it came out on VHS, and I was just awed and floored by it. I actually remember the night I watched this movie. Very few times do I remember movies I watched, but this one really struck me, and over the next 3 or 4 years, I watched it a couple more times. Really, really loved the movie. However, I had not seen it in the last, I would say, 25 years. So this year, in year 2020, I'm just over 40 years old, and I watched this movie, and it struck me, even though I've learned a lot about movies, and I dismiss a lot of movies I used to like as a kid, because of what I've learned over the last 25 years, I still really like this movie. Now, one of my major questions about it is this movie just appeal to males, or is it about the male psyche in general? There are no female characters in the movie besides one, very briefly. She's not even relevant, and so, because this is an all-male movie, and IMDb.com is very male-centric, I would say, in the ratings and the rankings, is this movie, does it appeal to everybody or mostly to males? I would love female commenters to let us know about that in the comments, and I would genuinely love their perspective on this all-male movie. Now, Shawshank Redemption is in a line of prison break movies, which I think a lot of people love because of their simplicity. A person wronged, and definitely in the case of this movie, Andy Dufresne, he's innocent, is in jail for a long time, and you want him to get out. It's sort of a wrong man story, but also it's being in jail, being in the cave of Plato, being in ignorance and darkness, literally, and then coming to enlightenment. Or, in the case of this movie as well, being chained and then being saved. There's a salvation message in this movie. Or being enslaved and going to freedom. And that happens with 3 characters in this movie. So, very simple yearnings on the part of the audiences rooting for these characters to get out of the brutal and violent jail, the all-metal, gray, dark, dank place that they're in. And as I'm saying, that's not only a literal place, prison, but it's also a metaphor for inner prisons or mental prisons, as they're sometimes called today. Now, the movie would seem to be about an individual, and a lot of prison break movies are about the individual trying to break out of jail, whether it's Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood. I would also say Papillon with Steve McQueen. Also, Robert Bresson's A Man Escaped, although there ends up being 2 people in that movie. But here you have Andy, the single individual who has the mind and the will, as we find out, spoiler, to break out of prison. And since Red, played by Morgan Freeman, his narration is focused on Andy, I think this movie has a trick. It's tricking us into believing this movie is about Andy, when, as we see with the final shot of this movie, it really is about friendship. It's also about Red breaking out of jail and going from darkness and enslavement to freedom. And his counterpart, Brooks Hatlin, who shows up in this movie and ends up having to kill himself because he's institutionalized and he can't break out of not only the prison that he's been in for 50 years, but the mental prisons, the prison itself, the institution, the system has caused him. He can't stand the freedom of being on his own. He has no friends, and so he kills himself, and that's a threat to Red. So this movie ends up being about not just Andy getting what he deserves, which is getting out of jail and righting the wrongs of the warden and the prison system, but also Red getting out and then finding his own freedom in the friendship with Andy, which I think is what the final shot is about. And you'll notice that the opening shot is Andy in the darkness, all alone, and this is right at the night of the crime that happens to him when he gets framed, of course. The end is two people meeting up on a beach. It's bright, it's open, it's shiny, it's paradise. And so there's a big difference, as you see, from this journey of the beginning and the opening shot to the final shot. The movie has a religious dimension as well, as I said, salvation. And of course, the warden is a total Christian hypocrite.
I believe in two things, discipline and the Bible. Here you'll receive both. Put your trust in the Lord. Your ass belongs to me.
When Andy shows up at the prison, the warden says you can't blaspheme against the Lord. That's the one rule. But of course, the warden allows the vicious prison guard to do this in front of the men. And as we see, the warden's a total hypocrite. He allows violence. He's a fraud. He allows theft. You know, he's all about stealing money, embezzling, and all those kinds of things that he involves Andy in. So the hypocrisy of a Bible-believing supposed man who can quote the scripture versus Andy, who can also quote scripture and also uses the Bible, but for salvific purposes to hide his rock hammer, which he's carving the wall to get out of jail. There's a contrast between the hypocrite and is Andy a believer or not? One could call this movie, I think, breaking out of a hypocritical Christian institutional system where the prison is an analogy for that. And I think Andy could be getting out of this sort of religious oppression of hypocrisy and violence that this prison system allows, run by this horrible warden. So maybe the movie is about breaking out of religious systems that oppress you. On the other hand, I find Andy to be actually it doesn't matter if he's atheist or a believer, he actually is a full-fledged human being. And in the movie, you see him reform the prison, or try to, from within. He's trying to bring light to the darkness, to reform the prison with the library. And you get him as a polymath of sorts, able to deal with numbers and accounting and business as he helps the prison guards and the warden. He's also into literature. He builds up the library. He sculpts, so he's an artist. And you see art peppered all over his walls. In fact, as the movie goes along in his jail cell, there's more and more artwork on the wall. I'm not talking about the Raquel Welch or Rita Hayworth posters, which play a factor in the movie, but all over the wall you see Andy interested in art. And then, of course, there's a scene where he gives the gift of operatic music, the Mozart aria, to the men, and he willingly risks himself in order to broadcast that music to everyone. He wants to bring the arts and general learning to a prison which doesn't allow learning. That, my friends, is the enlightenment of Andy, bringing light to the darkness. And there is a Plato's Cave allegory, I think, hinted at in the movie, of bringing education to the ignorant. Contrast that with a warden who wants to hush up everyone, keep them from learning. He allows the learning to happen because, Andy's his puppet. But, he would not allow this reformation otherwise, and wants to keep things dark, brutal, and violent with his minions and his guards doing his dirty work for him. To sum up then, we've got this movie is about male friendship. It's a religious allegory. It's about the love of learning. It's about a wronged man wanting to get out of prison and become free and get out of these institutions that oppress him, and in fact oppress all the prisoners. The prisoners are in a terrible environment, and they try their best to live that out with, Brooks getting the Raven, with Red, bringing economic freedom to some extent into the jail, able to bring things in and to buy and sell things. It creates an economy in the jail that's actually beneficial to the men. And then Andy bringing in all of his business learning plus his love of the arts. These men are trying to make the jail, the institution, flourish, but the jail is a metally, dark, dank, horrifically, chain link fence kind of thing. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons it's number one. It's very strong on males in whatever institution, and I don't care what color or religion or creed these males are, being oppressed by gigantic systems run by hypocritical, terrible people. And I don't care who you are, you felt that way, whether you're in the business world, whether you're in school, whether you feel that way about the political system you're under. You do feel like you're in a prison and you long, and I think a lot of movies talk about this, to get out and go to that utopian or paradisical place that is Sewataneo at the end of this movie. And so the movie gives you that dream of heaven on earth, let's say, escape, freedom, and so on, with Andy getting out and finding his place at the end of the movie on the beach with his best friend Red. I should list the problems in this movie, but in fact, Homer nods, a good movie. I can forgive its flaws, but I don't think Andy would have testified against himself, first of all. Even worse, though, I don't think Andy would have gone to the prison warden and said, "I'm innocent," and told about the evidence that he had for his innocence. He knows what the warden would have done, and I think that's a plot convenience. Nevertheless, I forgive this movie for several things. In fact, one of the great voices in this movie to me is the music by Thomas Newman. It's beautiful, it's amazing, it hits all the right notes, pun intended, and it's a wonderful soundtrack that I don't think anybody else could have done and made this movie what it is without Thomas Newman's soundtrack. This is a movie I can analyze all day long. Do not say that about a lot of movies. In fact, most movies I don't want to look at shot for shot. It might ruin them or it might make the movie worse. I think watching this movie shot for shot and analyzing why things are done the way they're done is worthy of this movie. In fact, I'll give you a tip. There are a lot of top-down or bird's-eye view shots in this movie showing ominous things. One of them, in fact, is when Andy is being held over the roof by the prison guard who needs to keep his money that he inherited. And the camera just swoops down from bird's eye view to level view to show you that Andy is on the level and going to be okay there. But that bird's eye view is quite ominous. Really interesting, though, that last shot, when Andy gets out of the jail and crawls through the sewer line, he is seen from above. And that should be ominous, but it's not. The movie music makes it seem not ominous. Why is that bird's eye view or semi-bird's eye view different than the other ones? And I think this is heaven as a metaphor looking down on Andy. As I said, it's a religious movie. It's the gods above. It's something above Andy helping him out, saving him perhaps, and the sign of freedom as he opens his arms. He is a Christ-like figure, knowing the Bible so well, using the rock hammer, which is a cross-like object, to get out of the hypocritical, awful prison he's in. I think because the movie shows him as that Christ-like figure who not only saves himself, he saves Red from potential suicide. That top-down shot is really, really, moving. And when I was, as I said, 15 years old watching this movie, it really moved me, and it still does 25 years later. So, for all those reasons, I think this movie is still quite good.